Sir, I'm going to need you to leave first class. The words were polite, but they landed with the weight of a judgment already made. Several passengers looked up from their phones. A few exchanged glances. One woman near the aisle let out a quiet laugh. And in less than 10 minutes, every person on that airplane would wish they had looked a little closer at the quiet man they were so eager to dismiss. The boarding process for Redwood Airways Flight 271 to Denver had been smooth until that moment. Soft jazz drifted through the cabin speakers while passengers settled into oversized leather seats. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisle, offering bottled water and warm smiles. Outside the large windows, the late afternoon sun painted the tarmac in shades of gold. It was the kind of peaceful scene that usually made people feel fortunate. But peace has a way of revealing character. Ethan Walker sat silently in seat 2A. He wore clean jeans, a simple navy button-down shirt, and a worn brown jacket that had seen better years. His hands rested calmly on the armrests. Hands roughened by work. Hands that carried quiet stories. Beside him sat his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and she clutched a small sketchbook against her chest. Every few seconds, she glanced out the window and smiled. This was her first time sitting in first class. Her excitement filled the space around her like sunlight. "Daddy," she whispered, careful not to disturb anyone. "Do you think they really bring hot chocolate before takeoff?" Ethan smiled. "That's what they told us." Sophie grinned. "This is the coolest birthday ever." Ethan looked at her for a moment. There was something almost sacred about seeing her happy. The last few years had not been easy. Raising a child alone rarely was. But today was different. Today was about her. He had saved for months, worked extra shifts, cashed in airline reward points accumulated from years of cleaning terminals most travelers never noticed. It wasn't luxury that mattered. It was the memory. Across the aisle, a sharply dressed woman lowered her designer sunglasses and stared openly at Ethan. Vanessa Montgomery was used to getting exactly what she wanted. Wealth had become her language. Status had become her identity. And from the moment she entered the cabin, she had noticed something she believed did not belong. Ethan. Her eyes moved over his clothes, his worn jacket, his weathered hands. Then they landed on the airport janitor identification badge clipped to his belt, forgotten after a long shift. Her expression hardened immediately. She leaned toward the flight attendant standing nearby. "Excuse me," she said. "I think there's been a mistake." The attendant blinked politely. "Ma'am." Vanessa pointed subtly toward Ethan. "That man." The attendant followed her gaze. "Yes." Vanessa lowered her voice, though not enough. "He's airport maintenance." Several nearby passengers began listening. "I saw him cleaning near gate 14 less than an hour ago." The attendant maintained her professional smile. "And?" Vanessa looked genuinely confused by the question. "And this is first class." A few quiet chuckles emerged from nearby seats. Ethan heard every word. He simply looked out the window. Sophie looked down at her sketchbook. The attendant hesitated. Experience had taught her that wealthy passengers often created difficult situations. Experience had also taught her that sometimes it was easier to investigate than argue. "Let me check his boarding pass," she said gently. Vanessa nodded as if justice was finally being served. The attendant approached Ethan. "Sir." Ethan turned calmly. "Yes, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" Ethan handed it over without complaint. The attendant examined it carefully. Everything appeared valid. Seat 2A. First class. Proper identification. No issues whatsoever. She should have walked away. But by then several passengers were watching, waiting, judging. The pressure of public opinion is often louder than facts. "Sir," she said cautiously, "would you mind stepping into the aisle for a moment?" Sophie's smile faded instantly. Ethan noticed. Of course. He stood slowly, quietly, without irritation, without embarrassment. The cabin seemed strangely still. Vanessa folded her arms, certain she had won. Sophie looked up at her father. "Daddy." Her small voice carried more concern than she intended. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart." He smiled gently. "Everything's okay." But deep inside, Sophie felt something she couldn't explain. Children notice dignity long before adults do. They recognize kindness before credentials. And in that moment, she knew her father had done nothing wrong. Yet somehow he was being treated as if he had. Outside the aircraft, baggage carts rolled across the tarmac. Inside, Whispers began moving from row to row. Nobody knew why the quiet man was being questioned. Most simply assumed there must be a reason. Because people often mistake confidence for truth, and appearances for facts. The flight attendant spoke softly. "Sir, there seems to be some concern regarding your seating assignment." Ethan nodded once. "I understand." No anger. No argument. No attempt to defend himself. Just calm acceptance. The kind that comes from a man who has nothing left to prove. And somewhere above them, inside the cockpit, a routine passenger manifest had just appeared on a screen. A pilot glanced at a familiar name, then looked again. Her heartbeat stopped for a fraction of a second, because after nearly 12 years, she had just found someone she never expected to see again. The attendant glanced once more at the boarding pass in her hand, then back at Ethan. Everything was correct. The seat was his. The reservation was legitimate. Yet uncertainty lingered in the cabin because doubt spreads faster than truth. Around them, conversations had softened into whispers. A businessman pretended to read an email while listening closely. A young couple exchanged curious looks. Vanessa Montgomery sat with the satisfied expression of someone convinced that status alone could determine where a person belonged. Ethan remained standing beside his seat, calm, patient, unmoved. Sophie looked up at him with wide blue eyes. "Daddy, are we still going to Denver?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled. "Of course we are. Promise. I promise." His voice carried the steady warmth that had guided her through every difficult moment since she was 5 years old. The attendant shifted uncomfortably. She was beginning to realize that the man before her was not upset because he knew something everyone else did not. There was a confidence about him that did not come from wealth, position, or appearance. It came from character. "Sir," she said carefully, "if you would just give us a few moments." Ethan nodded. "Take all the time you need." Sophie watched him closely. That was the thing she admired most about her father. He never raised his voice. He never demanded respect. Somehow people eventually gave it to him anyway. 3 years earlier, after a difficult day at school, Sophie had asked him why some people seemed so determined to prove they were important. Ethan had thought about the question for a long moment before answering. Because the people who know who they are do not need to convince anyone. At 9 years old, she had not fully understood. Sitting in that cabin now, she was beginning to. Near the front of the aircraft, the lead flight attendant stepped aside and quietly contacted operations. Procedures mattered. Documentation mattered. Appearances did not. Yet even as she spoke into her headset, another message arrived through the airline communication system. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then widened. She read the note twice. "Is something wrong?" Another crew member asked. "I do not know," she whispered. "But somebody from the cockpit is requesting passenger verification." The other attendant looked surprised. "For who?" She glanced toward Ethan. "Seat 2A. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to his seat beside Sophie. The whispers continued. Vanessa watched with growing irritation. She had expected him to be escorted away by now. The fact that he remained seated felt like a challenge to her assumptions. "This is unbelievable," she muttered loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Rules exist for a reason." Ethan did not respond. He simply looked out the window where ground crews moved beneath the fading sunlight. Beyond the runway, clouds stretched across the horizon like brushstrokes on a painting. For a moment, his expression softened. Certain memories never truly leave a person. They simply wait quietly in places where nobody else can see them. Sophie noticed the distant look in his eyes. "Are you thinking about Mom?" she asked gently. Ethan blinked, then nodded. "A little." Sophie reached for his hand. She would have loved this trip. Ethan squeezed her fingers. Yes, she would have. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind built from love. The kind that remains even after loss. Several rows away, a middle-aged passenger who had been observing everything leaned toward his wife. "Something is off here," he whispered. "What do you mean?" "Look at him." His wife glanced toward Ethan. "What about him?" "He is not embarrassed." She studied Ethan for a few seconds. "No, he is not." The husband nodded slowly. "Most people would be angry by now. Maybe he knows he belongs here." The observation lingered. Because belonging is often easier to recognize than explain. Up in the cockpit, Captain Amelia Brooks stared at the passenger manifest displayed on her screen. The name had caught her attention immediately. Ethan Walker. At first she had assumed it was coincidence. America had plenty of Ethan Walkers. But then she noticed the birth date. The hometown. The details aligned perfectly. Her pulse quickened. 12 years. 12 years since she had last seen the man who changed the course of her life. She remembered long days filled with pressure, responsibility, and impossible decisions. She remembered lessons that had nothing to do with aviation and everything to do with leadership. Most of all, she remembered a commander whose greatest strength was not authority but grace. Amelia slowly removed her headset. The first officer looked over. "Everything okay?" She stood. "I need to check something personally." "Now?" Amelia nodded. "Especially now." Back in the cabin, passengers continued waiting for answers. Vanessa crossed her arms. Sophie rested her head against Ethan's shoulder. The evening sunlight filtered through the windows, painting golden streaks across the seats. Then a subtle movement near the front of the aircraft drew every eye in the cabin. The cockpit door had opened, and the captain herself was stepping into the aisle. The moment Captain Amelia Brooks stepped into the aisle, something changed in the atmosphere of the aircraft. Conversations faded. Phones lowered. Even the steady hum of boarding seemed to retreat into the background. There was a certain presence that experienced leaders carried with them, and Amelia had spent years earning hers. Her crisp uniform reflected the warm cabin lights, but it was not authority that drew attention. It was purpose. She was looking for someone. Slowly, she walked down the aisle. A flight attendant moved aside. Another straightened instinctively. Passengers followed her with curious eyes. Vanessa Montgomery sat taller in her seat, clearly assuming the captain had arrived to resolve the situation in her favor. After all, people often expect authority to confirm their assumptions. But Amelia never even glanced in her direction. Her focus remained fixed farther down the cabin, towards seat 2A. Sophie noticed her first. "Daddy," she whispered. "The pilot is coming here." Ethan followed her gaze. For the first time since boarding began, a subtle expression crossed his face. Not surprise. Recognition. Amelia stopped beside his row. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The years between them seemed to disappear. The cabin waited. Ethan rose politely from his seat. "Captain," he said with a small nod. Amelia stared at him. 12 years. 12 years of wondering where life had taken the man who had shaped so much of her own journey. The same calm eyes. The same quiet composure. The same steady presence that had once reassured entire teams during moments of uncertainty. Her voice softened. "It really is you." Ethan smiled faintly. "It has been a while." Several passengers exchanged confused looks. Vanessa frowned. This was clearly not going according to plan. Amelia glanced at Sophie. "And who is this?" Sophie sat up straight. "I am Sophie Walker." Amelia smiled warmly. "You must be very proud of your father." Sophie looked at Ethan and nodded immediately. "I am." The answer carried a sincerity that touched something deep inside Amelia. She turned back toward Ethan. For a moment, she seemed almost emotional. Then she collected herself. Professional, composed, yet unable to hide her respect. "I cannot believe I finally found you," she said quietly. Ethan chuckled. "I was not aware anyone was looking." A few nearby passengers listened more closely now. The pieces did not fit. Why would the captain of a major airline know an airport janitor? Why was she speaking to him like an old mentor? Amelia folded her hands in front of her. Some people never forget the person who changed their life. The words hung in the air. Sophie blinked. Ethan looked slightly uncomfortable. Recognition had never been something he sought. "You give me too much credit," he said. "No," Amelia replied gently. "Not nearly enough." Silence followed. The kind of silence that appears when truth begins pushing aside assumptions. Near the aisle, one passenger lowered his newspaper entirely. Another removed his headphones. Vanessa shifted in her seat. Her confidence was beginning to crack. Amelia looked around the cabin briefly, then back at Ethan. "Do you remember what you told me during my first year?" Ethan laughed softly. "You may need to be more specific." "I was terrified of making mistakes." Amelia smiled at the memory. "And you told me that leadership was not about avoiding mistakes. It was about accepting responsibility when they happened." Ethan nodded. "That sounds like something I would say." It changed everything for me. Sophie listened with growing fascination. She had never heard anyone speak about her father this way. At home, he packed school lunches, fixed leaky faucets, helped with math homework. He never talked about himself. He never mentioned people whose lives he had influenced. Vanessa finally spoke. "Captain," she interrupted, "I am sure this is very touching. but there has been a seating issue. Amelia turned slowly. Her expression remained professional. A seating issue. Vanessa gestured toward Ethan. There were concerns about whether he belonged in first class. Amelia's eyes moved briefly toward Ethan, then toward the boarding pass still in the attendant's hand, then back to Vanessa. The corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. Not amusement. Certainty. I assure you, Amelia said calmly, Mr. Walker belongs exactly where he is. The words landed with quiet force. But it was what she said next that caused the entire front cabin to become perfectly still. Amelia looked directly at Ethan and spoke with a respect so natural that it seemed impossible to fake. Although, she added softly, the truth is that this is not the seat I remember you occupying. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, as if he already knew where the conversation was heading. And for the first time that day, the mystery surrounding the quiet man in seat 2A began to open. The cabin remained unusually quiet after Amelia's words. People who had been eager to judge now found themselves eager to understand. Curiosity had replaced certainty. Sophie looked from the captain to her father, sensing that an invisible door had just opened into a part of his life she had never seen before. Ethan exhaled slowly and glanced toward the window. The fading sunlight reflected across the glass, casting a warm glow across his face. For a moment he looked older. Not tired, just reflective. Amelia smiled gently. You always hated attention. Ethan chuckled under his breath. That has not changed. Some things never do. The captain's eyes softened with memory. You know, most people in this cabin probably see a quiet father taking his daughter on a trip. Ethan nodded. That sounds about right. What they do not see is the man who spent years teaching young officers how to lead with integrity. Several passengers exchanged surprised glances. Vanessa sat perfectly still now. The confidence she had displayed earlier was fading with every passing second. Sophie stared at her father. You taught pilots? Ethan looked at her and smiled. A long time ago. Why did you never tell me? She asked. Because it was just a job. Amelia laughed softly. Only Ethan Walker would describe that responsibility as just a job. The captain folded her hands as another memory surfaced. Years earlier, she had been 25 years old, ambitious, talented, and completely terrified of failure. Aviation demanded excellence. Leadership demanded even more. During her first months in training, she had struggled under the pressure. Every mistake felt enormous. Every decision felt permanent. Then she met Commander Ethan Walker. He never raised his voice, never embarrassed anyone, never relied on rank to earn respect. He simply carried himself with quiet confidence. One afternoon after a difficult training exercise, Amelia had sat alone reviewing her mistakes. The sun had been setting beyond the airfield. Orange lights stretched across the runway while aircraft rested in perfect rows. She remembered hearing footsteps approach. Ethan had sat beside her without saying a word. After several minutes, he finally spoke. You are working too hard to be perfect. Amelia had looked at him in confusion. Is that not the goal? Ethan smiled. No. The goal is to be trustworthy. The lesson stayed with her. Trustworthy leaders admitted mistakes. Trustworthy leaders listened. Trustworthy leaders served others before themselves. Those simple principles had guided her through every year that followed. Back in the cabin, Amelia looked at Sophie. Your father changed more careers than he knows. Sophie seemed amazed. Really? Absolutely. Ethan shook his head. People give me too much credit. No. Amelia replied. You simply never kept score. A few nearby passengers smiled. Even strangers could recognize sincerity when they heard it. Outside, airport workers continued moving luggage carts beneath the evening sky. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different than it had 20 minutes earlier. The judgment was gone. In its place was respect waiting to be understood. One older gentleman sitting across the aisle finally spoke. Sir, if you do not mind me asking, why are you working at the airport now? The question was sincere, not intrusive. Ethan considered it for a moment. Life changes. The man nodded. Ethan continued. After my wife passed away, priorities became simple. He looked toward Sophie. She needed me more than any career ever could. Sophie lowered her eyes for a moment. She missed her mother every day, but hearing her father say those words filled her with warmth. Ethan had never complained, never spoken about sacrifice. He had simply shown up every day. School lunches, parent conferences, Birthday cakes that leaned slightly to one side because he decorated them himself. Soccer practices, bedtime stories, ordinary acts of love repeated thousands of times. Amelia felt emotion tighten in her chest, because that was the part nobody saw. Not leadership programs, not flight operations, not professional achievements. The greatest thing Ethan Walker had ever done was sitting right beside him. Sophie smiled and leaned against his shoulder. Ethan wrapped an arm around her gently. For a few seconds the cabin became completely still. Then Amelia glanced toward the front of the aircraft and checked her watch. Boarding was nearly complete. She knew she should return to the cockpit soon. Yet there was one truth she had not shared. One detail that would explain why seeing Ethan's name on the manifest had stopped her cold. She looked back at him carefully. There is something these passengers should know. Ethan immediately shook his head. Amelia. No. Her voice remained gentle but firm. For once, you are going to let someone else tell the story. Ethan smiled helplessly. Sophie looked between them. What story? Amelia's expression turned thoughtful. The story of why every pilot from my generation still talks about a commander who walked away from prestige without regret. The passengers leaned in. Vanessa did too, though she tried not to show it. Amelia drew a slow breath. Because the next part of Ethan Walker's life was not about titles or status. It was about a decision that revealed exactly who he was. And it began on a rainy morning 12 years earlier, when he was offered a future that most people would have spent their entire lives chasing. Amelia glanced down the aisle, and for a moment seemed transported back more than a decade. The passengers waited. Sophie listened carefully. Ethan looked as though he already knew exactly what story was about to be told and wished it were not. 12 years ago, Amelia began. The aviation community believed Ethan Walker was headed for one of the most respected leadership positions in the country. Several passengers exchanged surprised looks. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. Amelia smiled. See? He still hates hearing it. A few people laughed softly. The tension that had once filled the cabin had begun to melt away. Amelia continued. At the time, everyone expected him to accept a promotion that would have changed his entire future. It came with prestige, influence, travel, and opportunities most people only dream about. Sophie looked up at her father. You never told me that. Ethan shrugged gently. It was a long time ago. Why did you not take it? Sophie asked. Amelia answered before Ethan could. Because life gave him a different mission. The words settled quietly over the cabin. Outside the aircraft windows, the last traces of daylight painted the clouds in shades of gold and amber. Inside, every seat seemed occupied by someone leaning just a little closer. Amelia remembered the day clearly. Rain had tapped steadily against the windows of a conference center overlooking a regional airfield. Executives, officers, and aviation leaders had gathered to discuss future appointments. Ethan's name had been on every short list. His reputation was exceptional. People trusted him. They respected him. More importantly, they followed him willingly. Everyone assumed he would say yes, Amelia explained. The offer represented everything people spend years chasing. Ethan stared quietly toward the floor. Then he received a phone call. Sophie tilted her head. From Mom. Ethan nodded slowly. Amelia smiled. Your mother had just learned some important news. Sophie watched her father carefully. About me? About you, Ethan said softly. The realization spread across her face. Amelia continued. The timing could not have been more complicated. One path led toward greater responsibility and recognition. The other path led somewhere completely different. Ethan laughed quietly. You make it sound dramatic. Because it was. Amelia folded her arms. Most people spend their lives trying to balance ambition and family. You made your choice in less than 5 minutes. Several passengers smiled. One woman near the front dabbed at her eye. Ethan looked uncomfortable again. It was not difficult. Amelia shook her head. It was difficult. You just knew what mattered more. Sophie squeezed her father's arm. Ethan smiled down at her. Amelia remembered that afternoon perfectly. The rain, the gray sky, the anticipation in the room. She remembered senior leaders waiting for Ethan's answer. She remembered people discussing future plans as though the decision had already been made. Then Ethan had entered the room carrying a simple folder. Calm, respectful, certain. He thanked everyone for their confidence. Then he declined the opportunity. No dramatic speech. No lengthy explanation. Just gratitude and conviction. The room had been stunned. One executive even asked if he needed more time to think. Ethan's response had become legendary among those who heard it. Amelia looked directly at Sophie. "Do you know what he said?" Sophie shook her head. Amelia smiled. "He said that titles can wait, but children cannot." The cabin fell silent. Genuine silence. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. Ethan looked down, clearly wishing the story would move on. Sophie wrapped both arms around his. "You really said that?" Ethan nodded. "Something like that." "That is exactly what you said," Amelia replied. "I wrote it down afterward because I never wanted to forget it." Across the aisle, the older gentleman who had spoken earlier smiled warmly. "That is a rare thing these days." Ethan looked at him and answered simply, "Family is not rare. We just forget how valuable it is." The man nodded slowly. Amelia could see the effect Ethan's words continued to have on people even now. That had always been his gift. Not commanding attention, changing perspective. One conversation at a time. Sophie rested her head against his shoulder again. "I am glad you chose me." Ethan's expression softened. There was never another choice. The sincerity in his voice made several passengers smile. Even some crew members standing nearby seemed moved. Vanessa sat quietly now. The certainty that had fueled her earlier judgment had disappeared completely. She had spent years measuring people by appearance, status, and influence. Yet the man she had dismissed so quickly possessed something far more difficult to earn. Character. Amelia glanced toward the cockpit again. Departure time was approaching. Soon she would have to return to her duties. Yet there was still one piece of the story missing. The most surprising piece of all. She looked back at Ethan. The funny thing is that turning down that opportunity was not what earned you everyone's respect. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Amelia." "No," she said with a grin. "You started this by boarding my airplane." Sophie looked up immediately. "What happened next?" Amelia's smile widened. "What happened next is the reason an entire generation of pilots still remembers Commander Ethan Walker by name." Amelia leaned lightly against the seat beside Ethan and smiled at the memory that was clearly playing through her mind. The passengers waited. Even the crew seemed captivated now. The airplane had become something unusual. It was no longer just a flight. It was a room full of strangers discovering the value of a man they had almost overlooked. "The reason people still remember him," Amelia said, "has nothing to do with rank." Ethan sighed quietly. Sophie immediately noticed. "Daddy already knows this story." "Oh, he definitely knows this story," Amelia replied with a grin. "He just wishes I would stop telling it." A few passengers laughed softly. Ethan shook his head. "Some things are better left in the past." "Not this," Amelia said. Then her expression grew thoughtful. "Because this happened when nobody was watching." The cabin became still again. Amelia remembered the winter morning clearly. Snow had covered the runways outside a regional training facility. The wind rattled the windows. Delays were piling up across multiple airports. Tempers were short. Schedules were falling apart. It was the kind of day that revealed who people really were. At the time, Amelia was still early in her career. She had been helping coordinate a complicated schedule change involving dozens of trainees and instructors. Everybody was stressed. Everybody wanted answers. Everybody was looking for someone else to blame. "A lot of people think leadership happens during important speeches," Amelia said. "But that is not where I learned it." She glanced at Ethan. "I learned it in an airport cafeteria." Several passengers looked confused. Sophie blinked. "A cafeteria?" "A cafeteria," Amelia confirmed. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as if he knew exactly where this was going. Amelia smiled. That morning the weather had stranded hundreds of travelers. Families were sleeping on chairs. Employees had been working double shifts. Everybody was exhausted. She paused. "Including us." The memory felt vivid even now. She remembered carrying paperwork through the terminal. She remembered long lines stretching toward the ticket counters. She remembered frustration hanging in the air like static electricity. Then she remembered spotting Ethan. Not in a conference room. Not leading a meeting. Not issuing instructions. He was standing in line at a cafeteria carrying a tray. "At first I thought he was grabbing breakfast," Amelia said. "Then I noticed something." Sophie leaned forward. "What?" The tray was not for him. Amelia's voice softened. It was for a little boy sitting alone near the windows. Several passengers exchanged glances. Amelia continued. The child looked about 7 years old. His flight had been canceled. His mother was stuck somewhere across the country. He had been crying for hours. Ethan shifted slightly in his seat. He was hungry. Amelia smiled. That was your explanation. It was true. You bought him breakfast, then lunch, then dinner. Ethan shrugged. The airport was chaos. You stayed with him for almost 10 hours. Sophie looked stunned. You never told me that. Ethan smiled gently. It was not a big deal. Amelia laughed. There it is again. She looked around the cabin. Every meaningful thing he ever did was apparently not a big deal. A few passengers chuckled, yet nobody missed the affection in her voice. Amelia remembered watching Ethan throughout that day. The child had slowly stopped crying. They played card games, talked about airplanes, shared snacks. Ethan made certain he felt safe until family members arrived. No cameras, no recognition, no audience, just kindness. That story spread everywhere, Amelia explained. Not because of what happened, because of why it happened. Sophie tilted her head. Why? Amelia looked at Ethan. Because when somebody asked why he spent his entire day helping a stranger, he said something nobody forgot. Ethan immediately groaned. Please do not quote me. Amelia ignored him completely. He said that leadership is simply taking care of the person standing closest to you. The words settled over the cabin. Quiet, simple, powerful. A businessman near the front slowly nodded. An elderly woman smiled warmly. Even some of the crew members looked emotional. Ethan stared out the window. Not embarrassed exactly, just uncomfortable being the center of attention. Sophie wrapped her hand around his arm. That sounds like you. Ethan smiled. I hope so. Outside, the last sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. The cabin lights glowed softly overhead. The atmosphere felt different now. Lighter, warmer. The kind of feeling that appears when people are reminded that goodness still exists. Amelia glanced toward the front of the aircraft once more. Departure time had nearly arrived. Yet one final memory remained. The most important one. The one that explained why seeing Ethan's name on the passenger list had nearly taken her breath away. She looked directly at him. You know, she said quietly, none of those stories are actually why I came out of the cockpit. Ethan's expression changed slightly. He knew exactly what she meant. Sophie noticed immediately. Then why did you? Amelia's eyes softened. Because there is one thing your father never talks about. The cabin fell silent again. Completely silent. Amelia drew a careful breath. And it is the reason that whenever pilots from my generation hear the name Ethan Walker, they still stand a little straighter. For the first time since Amelia had stepped into the cabin, Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not because of the attention, not because of the passengers, because he knew exactly which story she was about to tell. Sophie noticed immediately. Daddy? She asked softly. Ethan smiled, but there was a trace of hesitation in it. Some stories belong to other people. Amelia shook her head. Not this one. The cabin remained completely still. The aircraft doors had already been secured. The final preparations for departure were underway. Yet nobody seemed concerned about schedules anymore. Every person in first class was listening. Even the flight attendants had quietly gathered nearby. Amelia folded her hands and looked down the aisle. About 11 years ago, a group of young pilots completed an advanced leadership program. Her eyes drifted back toward Ethan. Most of us thought we had all the answers. A few passengers smiled. Amelia laughed softly. Actually, that is not true. We thought we knew everything. Ethan chuckled. That sounds more accurate. Exactly. The warmth between them was unmistakable. It was the warmth shared by people connected through years of respect rather than circumstance. Amelia continued. Graduation day arrived. Families filled the auditorium. Cameras flashed. Awards were handed out. Speeches were given. She paused. And then something happened that nobody expected. Sophie leaned forward. What? One of the graduating pilots was supposed to receive the highest leadership recognition in the program. Ethan immediately looked away. Amelia smiled knowingly. You see? He still does that. The passengers followed her gaze toward Ethan. The award carried tremendous prestige, Amelia explained. People competed for years hoping to earn it. Careers were built around accomplishments like that. Sophie blinked. Did Daddy win? Amelia nodded. Unanimously. Several passengers exchanged surprised looks. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Every new piece of information seemed to make her earlier assumptions feel smaller. Amelia continued. But when his name was announced, something unusual happened. She could still picture it clearly. The auditorium had erupted in applause. Hundreds of people had stood to recognize Ethan Walker. Yet instead of walking directly to the stage, he had quietly crossed the room. There was a maintenance employee working near the back in trance, Amelia said. An older gentleman. He had worked there for decades. Ethan sighed softly. Amelia, I am telling it. Her smile remained gentle. The man was preparing to retire. Most people barely noticed him. He cleaned classrooms, repaired broken equipment, opened buildings before sunrise. She looked around the cabin. The kind of person everybody depends on and almost nobody thanks. The passengers listened carefully. Sophie squeezed her father's arm. Amelia continued. When Ethan reached the stage, he accepted the award. Then he did something nobody expected. The memory still made her emotional. He walked back down from the stage, crossed the entire auditorium, and handed the award to that maintenance worker. Several passengers blinked in disbelief. One woman covered her mouth. Sophie stared at her father. You gave it away? Ethan shrugged. It seemed like the right thing to do. Amelia laughed softly. That was his explanation then, too. She looked around the cabin. Do you know what he said? Nobody answered. Amelia's voice softened. He said that leadership was not measured by how many people salute you. It was measured by how many people you serve. Silence settled over the cabin once more. Not the silence of surprise. The silence of understanding. Ethan looked out the window. He never seemed interested in defending his reputation or building one. He simply lived according to principles that remained unchanged whether people noticed or not. Sophie rested her head against his shoulder. Her eyes glistened slightly. I wish Mom could hear all of this. Ethan wrapped an arm around her. She already knew. The answer was simple, honest, and somehow it carried more weight than any story Amelia had told. Across the aisle, the older gentleman smiled warmly. A flight attendant quietly wiped at the corner of her eye. Even Vanessa seemed unable to meet Ethan's gaze. Amelia looked at the passengers and then back at Ethan. That day became famous throughout the program. She smiled. Not because somebody won an award. Because somebody gave one away. Ethan shook his head. People remember strange things. No, Amelia replied softly. People remember character. The words lingered. The cabin felt different now. Not because Ethan's past was impressive. Because his past matched exactly who he was in the present. The same humility. The same grace. The same quiet strength. Amelia glanced toward the cockpit. It was finally time for her to return. Yet before she left, there was one final thing she intended to do. Something she had waited 12 years to say. She looked directly at Ethan Walker and stood a little straighter. And for the second time that afternoon, every person in the cabin felt that something important was about to happen. The silence inside the cabin felt different now. It was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the silence that comes when people realize they have misjudged someone. Amelia stood beside Ethan's seat for a moment longer, her posture straight, her expression calm. Yet there was unmistakable emotion behind her eyes. 12 years had passed, and she had finally found the mentor she never expected to see again. Sophie looked from Amelia to her father. What are you going to say? She asked softly. Amelia smiled. Something I should have said a long time ago. Ethan immediately shook his head. Amelia, that is not necessary. It is. Her answer was gentle but firm. Around them, every passenger seemed to sense that the moment mattered. The older gentleman across the aisle folded his newspaper completely. The young couple near the front removed their headphones. Even the flight attendants stood quietly nearby. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. Amelia drew a slow breath. There are people who teach skills, she began. There are people who teach procedures. There are people who teach careers. Her eyes remained fixed on Ethan. And then there are people who teach character. Ethan looked down briefly. Sophie squeezed his hand. Amelia continued. Everything I have accomplished in aviation started with lessons I learned from this man. The words settled over the cabin. Vanessa stared at the floor. The same man she had dismissed because of a work badge was now being credited by the captain of the aircraft for shaping her entire career. Amelia smiled at Sophie. Your father never cared about being the smartest person in the room. Sophie nodded. That sounds like him. What he cared about was making everybody else better. Ethan laughed quietly. Now you are definitely exaggerating. Not even a little. Amelia's voice carried absolute certainty. She glanced toward the crew members standing nearby. Do you know how many pilots still quote him? Several of the attendants looked surprised. Really? One asked. Amelia nodded. All the time. She looked back at Ethan. Especially one phrase. Ethan immediately recognized where this was going. Please do not. Amelia ignored him completely. Whenever a difficult decision had to be made, he would remind us that integrity means doing the right thing after the applause stops. The cabin became perfectly still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The sentence was simple, yet something about it felt timeless. Sophie looked at her father with new appreciation. You said that? Ethan shrugged. Probably. A few passengers laughed softly. Amelia shook her head with affection. That answer is exactly why people respect you. Outside the windows, the airport lights had begun glowing against the darkening evening sky. The runway shimmered beneath rows of bright lamps. Inside, however, nobody seemed focused on the flight anymore. They were focused on Ethan Walker. Not because of achievements, because every story pointed toward the same truth. The man was exactly who he appeared to be. Kind, humble, consistent. Amelia looked down the aisle for a moment before returning her attention to Ethan. There is one last thing. Ethan sighed dramatically. Of course there is. Sophie laughed. Daddy, just let her finish. I am beginning to realize I have no choice. The warmth between them drew smiles from nearby passengers. Amelia took a step back and straightened her uniform jacket. Her expression became more formal, more deliberate. The subtle change immediately caught everyone's attention. Ethan noticed it too. His smile faded slightly. Amelia. No. Her voice remained respectful. I have waited 12 years for this opportunity. The atmosphere shifted once more. The crew members stood straighter. The passengers looked on with anticipation. Sophie blinked in confusion. What is happening? Amelia looked down at her. Something overdue. Then she turned fully toward Ethan. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Even the ordinary sounds of boarding had faded away. For a moment, there was only silence. Respectful silence. Meaningful silence. Amelia raised her hand slowly to her forehead in a precise gesture of honor and respect. The motion was so unexpected that several passengers gasped quietly. Ethan's eyes widened. Amelia. She held the gesture. Commander Walker. The words landed with remarkable force. Not because they were loud. Because they were sincere. The title seemed to echo through the cabin. Several passengers stared in disbelief. Sophie looked up at her father with wide eyes. Vanessa froze completely. And for the first time that evening, the truth was no longer hidden behind stories or memories. The quiet airport janitor sitting in seat 2A was not simply a father taking his daughter on a birthday trip. He was a man whose character had earned respect that endured long after rank, position, and titles had faded away. For several seconds after Amelia spoke the title, nobody said a word. The cabin seemed suspended between disbelief and understanding. Ethan stood quietly beside his seat, his expression almost apologetic, as though he wished the moment belonged to someone else. Amelia slowly lowered her hand. The respect in her eyes had not changed. Neither had the respect now visible throughout the cabin. Sophie stared at her father. Commander, she whispered. Ethan looked down at her and smiled gently. That was a long time ago, sweetheart. But it was real? Ethan nodded. Yes. Sophie blinked several times as she processed everything she had heard. The father who packed lunches, fixed broken toys, and worked late shifts cleaning airport terminals suddenly seemed connected to a world she had never imagined. Yet somehow he still felt exactly the same. That realization made her smile. Across the aisle, the older gentleman slowly stood. Nobody expected it. He adjusted his jacket and looked directly at Ethan. Sir, he said respectfully, thank you. Ethan appeared genuinely surprised. For what? The man smiled. For reminding all of us that character matters more than titles. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. That is kind of you. Then something remarkable happened. Another passenger stood. Then another. Not because anyone instructed them to. Not because they were following a trend. Because respect is contagious when it is genuine. Within moments, several people throughout the first-class cabin were on their feet. The atmosphere felt less like an airplane and more like a gathering of people witnessing something meaningful. Vanessa remained seated. Her hands rested tightly in her lap. The confidence she had carried earlier had completely disappeared. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed uncertain of herself. Amelia noticed. She understood what many people in the cabin were realizing. This story was never really about aviation. It was never about leadership programs or awards. It was about assumptions. The dangerous habit of deciding who someone is before learning their story. Sophie looked around in amazement. Daddy, she whispered. They are standing for you. Ethan glanced at the passengers and immediately shook his head. They are standing for the values we all believe in. Amelia laughed softly. You cannot help yourself, can you? Ethan smiled. Probably not. A few passengers laughed. The warmth returned to the cabin. Yet beneath it remained something deeper. A growing awareness that the quietest person in the room had become the most respected. Amelia checked her watch and reluctantly accepted that she needed to return to the cockpit. The flight could not wait forever. She took a step backward. I should get back to work. Sophie looked disappointed. You are leaving? I have a plane to fly. Amelia smiled. But before I go, there is one more thing. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. There is always one more thing. Amelia grinned. You know me too well. She turned toward the flight attendants. Could somebody bring me the passenger microphone? One of the attendants immediately retrieved it. Several passengers exchanged curious looks. Ethan looked concerned. Amelia, trust me. She accepted the microphone and held it for a moment. The cabin became quiet once again. Amelia looked directly at Ethan. 12 years ago, Commander Walker taught me that leadership means recognizing people when they least expect it and deserve it most. She paused. Today feels like one of those moments. Ethan looked as though he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Sophie, however, was smiling so brightly that it softened his resistance. Amelia raised the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, before our departure, I would like to acknowledge a passenger whose influence continues to shape countless aviation professionals across this country. Several passengers nodded. Others listened with complete attention. Amelia continued. Many years ago, this man taught a generation of leaders that integrity matters more than recognition, service matters more than status, and character matters more than appearance. Her voice remained calm, but carried through the entire cabin. And on behalf of those whose lives he improved, I simply want to say thank you. Silence followed. Not because nobody had anything to say, because some moments are too meaningful for immediate applause. Then Sophie did something unexpected. She reached for her father's hand and held it tightly. I am proud of you, Dad. Ethan looked at her. In all the stories Amelia had shared, in all the recognition he had received, nothing seemed to affect him as deeply as those 6 words. And as the cabin watched the father and daughter sitting side by side beneath the soft cabin lights, many began to understand that the greatest achievement in Ethan Walker's life had never been the title he once carried. It was the little girl sitting beside him now. Amelia lowered the microphone slowly. The cabin remained silent for another heartbeat before warm applause spread through the aircraft. It was not loud or dramatic. It was sincere, the kind of appreciation that comes when people recognize something real. Ethan sat quietly beside Sophie, looking as though he wished the attention would drift somewhere else. Sophie, however, seemed determined to absorb every second of it. Her smile was impossible to hide. Amelia laughed softly. There it is. Ethan looked up. What? The exact expression you always made whenever someone thanked you. Several passengers chuckled. Ethan shook his head. I never knew I had one. Trust me, you did. Amelia handed the microphone back to the attendant. Her duties were calling her back to the cockpit, but the atmosphere she was leaving behind felt completely different from the one she had entered. Earlier, people had seen a janitor. Now they saw a father, a mentor, a leader, a man whose dignity had survived every changed life placed in front of him. Amelia took one final step toward Ethan. I really am glad I found you. Ethan smiled. I am glad you did too. You know, Amelia said, there are a lot of people who still ask about you. Ethan laughed. That is difficult to believe. It should not be. Her expression softened. Good leaders are remembered. Great ones are missed. For a moment neither spoke. The years between them seemed filled with unspoken gratitude. Sophie watched carefully. She was beginning to understand that respect was not something her father had collected. It was something he had earned one person at a time. Amelia glanced toward Sophie. Take care of him. Sophie grinned immediately. I do. I can see that. Ethan looked amused. Apparently everyone thinks I need supervision. Only because you spend all your time taking care of everyone else. Amelia winked before finally turning toward the front of the aircraft. Several passengers nodded respectfully as she passed. A few quietly thanked her. Others simply smiled. When she disappeared through the cockpit door, the cabin remained unusually peaceful. The energy had changed. Conversations resumed, but softly, thoughtfully. as though people were reflecting on something larger than themselves. Ethan settled back into his seat. Sophie leaned against him. For several moments, they simply watched the airport lights beyond the window. Then a quiet voice interrupted. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan turned. Vanessa Montgomery was standing in the aisle. Gone was the confidence she had displayed earlier. Gone was the certainty. For the first time since boarding, she looked genuinely nervous. Several nearby passengers noticed immediately. Ethan remained calm. "Yes." Vanessa hesitated. Words seemed difficult to find. "I owe you an apology." The cabin grew quiet once more. Not because anyone wanted drama, because everybody understood how difficult a sincere apology could be. Vanessa looked down briefly. "I made assumptions about you." Ethan said nothing. She continued. "Actually, that is not true. I did not make assumptions. I made judgments." The honesty surprised several people. Vanessa drew a careful breath. "I looked at your work badge and decided who you were before I knew anything about you." Ethan listened quietly. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction either, just patience. Vanessa's voice softened. "I was wrong." The words hung in the air. Simple, direct, genuine. Ethan smiled gently. "Thank you." She blinked. "That is all. What else would there be?" Vanessa stared at him. Almost everyone else did too. Ethan shrugged lightly. "We all get things wrong sometimes." The answer seemed to surprise her more than any criticism could have. Sophie looked up at her father proudly. Vanessa slowly nodded. "You are a better person than I would have been in this situation." Ethan smiled. "Maybe today." A few passengers laughed softly. The tension dissolved. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed for the first time. "For what it is worth," she said quietly, "your daughter is very lucky." Ethan glanced toward Sophie. "I think I am the lucky one." Sophie beamed. Vanessa smiled and returned to her seat. The apology had not erased the earlier mistake, but it had transformed something else. Pride had given way to humility, and humility always leaves room for growth. As the aircraft finally began pushing back from the gate, the cabin lights dimmed slightly. The engines hummed gently beneath the floor. Outside, the city lights stretched across the darkness like scattered stars. Inside, Ethan Walker sat exactly where he had been sitting from the beginning. Same seat, same clothes, same quiet presence. Yet somehow the entire cabin saw him differently now. And the most remarkable part was that he had not changed at all. The aircraft eased away from the gate with a gentle motion. Outside the windows, rows of lights drifted slowly past while the runway stretched ahead into the evening darkness. Inside the cabin, a rare sense of calm settled over everyone. The earlier tension felt distant now, almost unreal. Sophie sat quietly beside her father, still replaying everything she had learned. Every few moments, she glanced at him as if seeing him through new eyes. Ethan noticed. "What?" he asked with a smile. Sophie shook her head. "I am just thinking." "Dangerous habit." She laughed. "No, really. I keep wondering how many things I do not know about you." Ethan leaned back in his seat. "Probably fewer than you think." "I do not believe that anymore." Several nearby passengers smiled at the exchange. It felt honest, familiar. The kind of conversation that could only exist between a father and daughter who trusted each other completely. As the aircraft paused briefly before taxiing, one of the flight attendants approached Ethan's row carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate. "Compliments of the captain," she said. Sophie's eyes widened immediately. "Really?" The attendant nodded. She was very specific about it. Sophie accepted the cup carefully. "Thank you." Ethan smiled. "Please thank her for us." The attendant hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Mr. Walker?" "Yes. I just wanted to say that today reminded me of something I needed to hear." Ethan looked surprised. "What is that?" She smiled gently. "That dignity does not need an audience." For a second, Ethan said nothing. Then he nodded. "Thank you." After she walked away, Sophie looked at him thoughtfully. "People keep saying things like that." "Like what?" "Like you changed their lives." Ethan chuckled softly. "Most people change each other's lives without realizing it." Sophie considered that. "Maybe. But it sounds like you did it a lot." Ethan looked out the window. The lights of the airport reflected across the glass. "Sweetheart, nobody gets through life alone. Every good thing I learned came from somebody else first." "Grandpa," Ethan smiled. Grandpa was one of them. The memory brought warmth to his face. Sophie loved hearing stories about the grandfather she barely remembered. "What did he teach you?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "That how you treat people matters more than what people think of you." Sophie nodded slowly. I think he would be proud of you. Ethan's eyes softened. I hope so. Across the aisle, the older gentleman who had spoken earlier listened quietly. After a moment, he leaned over. For what it is worth, I think he would. Ethan laughed modestly. You never even met him. No, the man replied. But I met his son. The simple answer drew smiles from several nearby passengers. Even Ethan seemed momentarily speechless. As the aircraft finally began rolling toward the runway, the cabin lights dimmed further. The atmosphere grew peaceful. People settled into their seats. Conversations faded into quiet reflection. Yet one person remained unusually thoughtful. Vanessa Montgomery sat several rows away staring out her own window. Earlier that afternoon, she had been certain she understood success. She had spent years measuring worth through titles, wealth, and appearances. Now those measurements felt strangely empty. After a long moment, she stood and walked back toward Ethan's row one final time. Sophie noticed her first. Vanessa stopped beside the aisle. I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all, Ethan said kindly. Vanessa looked at Sophie. Your father taught me something today. Sophie smiled. He does that apparently. A few passengers laughed softly. Vanessa smiled too. Then she turned back to Ethan. I spent most of my life trying to be impressive. Ethan listened quietly. Today I realized I should have been trying to be useful. The words lingered. They were not dramatic, but they were honest. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. It is never too late. Vanessa's eyes glistened slightly. Thank you. This time there was no embarrassment. No awkwardness. Just gratitude. She returned to her seat, carrying something far more valuable than pride. A lesson. Sophie watched her go. Do you think she will change? Ethan looked down at his daughter. People can surprise you. Even grown-ups. Especially grown-ups. Sophie smiled and rested her head against his shoulder. Outside, the runway lights lined up ahead like a path through the darkness. Inside, the passengers settled into silence. Yet it was no longer the silence of strangers sharing a flight. It was the silence of people who had witnessed a reminder that character lasts longer than achievement, kindness travels farther than status, and respect earned quietly is often the strongest kind of all. The aircraft accelerated smoothly down the runway before lifting into the night sky. City lights shimmered below like scattered diamonds before slowly fading beneath a blanket of clouds. Inside the cabin, the steady sound of the engines created a peaceful rhythm. Most passengers settled back into their seats, yet very few returned to what they had been doing before. Something about the journey had changed them. Ethan looked out the window while Sophie sipped the last of her hot chocolate. What are you thinking about? She asked. Ethan smiled. Honestly, I am thinking about how strange this day has been. Sophie laughed. I think everybody on this airplane would agree with that. Ethan nodded. Probably. Across the cabin, conversations drifted quietly from row to row. Not about business meetings. Not about schedules. People were talking about family. About mentors. About the people who had influenced their lives. It was as if Ethan's story had reminded everyone of someone they had forgotten to appreciate. A young man near the front pulled out his phone and began typing a message. His wife glanced over. Who are you texting? My high school coach. Your coach. He believed in me before anybody else did. He smiled. I have not thanked him in years. Nearby, an older woman wiped a tear from her eye while reading through old photographs. Across the aisle, a businessman closed his laptop for the first time all evening and simply stared out the window. Reflection seemed to move through the cabin like a quiet current. Sophie noticed it too. Daddy, yes. Did you know all of this would happen when we got on the plane? Ethan laughed. Not even a little. Good. Why? Sophie smiled. Because if you did, it would be weird. Ethan shook his head, laughing softly. A few nearby passengers smiled at the exchange. There was something comforting about seeing that despite everything they had learned, Ethan remained exactly who he had been at the beginning of the day. No different. No larger than life. Just a father enjoying time with his daughter. A flight attendant approached again, carrying a small envelope. Mr. Walker? Ethan looked up. Yes. Captain Brooks asked me to give this to you after takeoff. Ethan accepted it with curiosity. The envelope contained a simple handwritten note. Sophie leaned closer. What does it say? Ethan read silently for a moment before smiling. Nothing complicated. Can I hear it? Ethan handed her the card. Sophie read aloud. Thank you for teaching us that respect is something you give, not something you demand. She paused and smiled. That sounds like her. Ethan nodded. It does. Sophie carefully returned the note. Are you going to keep it? Absolutely. For several moments, neither spoke. Outside, moonlight reflected across endless clouds. The cabin lights had dimmed further, creating a calm golden glow. It felt almost peaceful enough to stop time. Then the older gentleman across the aisle leaned toward Ethan one more time. May I ask you a question? Ethan nodded. Of course. The man smiled. After everything you accomplished, do you ever miss the title? Several nearby passengers listened quietly. Ethan thought for a moment. Then he looked at Sophie. She had fallen partially asleep against his shoulder. One hand still rested around his arm. His expression softened immediately. No, he said. Not really. Why not? The man asked. Ethan glanced out the window again. Because life gave me something better. The answer was so simple that nobody responded right away. They did not need to. The meaning was obvious. Titles eventually end. Careers eventually change. Recognition eventually fades. But love remains. Purpose remains. Family remains. The older gentleman nodded slowly. That is a good answer. Ethan smiled. It is an honest one. Silence returned. Comfortable silence. Meaningful silence. Throughout the cabin, people rested, reflected, or quietly watched the clouds pass beyond the windows. Earlier that day, many of them had boarded thinking success could be recognized by appearance. Now they understood something different. The strongest people are often the quietest. The most impressive lives are often hidden inside ordinary routines. And the greatest measure of a person is not what they achieve when everyone is watching, but who they become when nobody is. Ethan sat peacefully with his daughter sleeping beside him, unaware that the lesson he had taught so many years ago was still unfolding around him. Not through speeches, not through titles, but through the simple example of a life lived with dignity, grace, humility, and respect. Several hours later, the aircraft began its gradual descent toward Denver. The cabin lights brightened softly as passengers stirred from sleep and quiet reflection. Outside the windows, the first lights of the city glowed beneath the darkness like a sea of gold. Sophie slowly opened her eyes and looked up at her father. For a moment, she seemed disoriented. Then she smiled. Did I fall asleep? Ethan laughed quietly. A little. For how long? Long enough to miss the clouds. Sophie stretched and looked out the window. I can live with that. The simple exchange brought smiles to a few nearby passengers. Throughout the flight, something subtle had happened. Strangers had become more thoughtful. Conversations had become kinder. The atmosphere carried a warmth that had not existed when they first boarded. Ethan noticed it too, though he would never have taken credit for it. That was simply not who he was. As the aircraft continued descending, the captain's voice came over the speaker system. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Thank you for flying with us this evening. Amelia paused briefly before continuing. And if you will allow me one final thought. Sometimes the most extraordinary people travel among us unnoticed. May we all remember to look a little closer and judge a little slower. The message lasted only a few seconds, but every passenger understood exactly what she meant. Sophie smiled proudly. Ethan simply shook his head with quiet amusement. She is going to make sure I never hear the end of this. Sophie laughed. Good. The aircraft touched down smoothly. Applause broke out in several parts of the cabin. Not because the landing was dramatic, but because the journey had become something none of them expected. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, people began gathering their belongings. Yet many paused before leaving. The older gentleman crossed the aisle and extended his hand. Ethan shook it warmly. Thank you for the conversation, the man said. Thank you for yours, Ethan replied. A young couple stopped next, then a businesswoman, then several others. None of them asked for photographs. None of them requested anything at all. They simply wanted to express appreciation, respect, gratitude. Ethan accepted each gesture with the same humility. Sophie watched every interaction carefully. Finally, she leaned closer. Daddy, yes. I think I figured something out. Ethan smiled. What is that? Sophie thought for a moment. Everybody keeps talking about your title. Ethan nodded. Some of them do. She shook her head. But that is not why they respect you. Ethan looked at her curiously. No. No, Sophie smiled. They respect you because you treat everybody the same. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders. That might be the smartest thing anybody said all day. Sophie grinned. When the cabin door finally opened, passengers began stepping into the aisle. Vanessa Montgomery waited near the exit. As Ethan and Sophie approached, she smiled warmly. "Have a wonderful birthday trip." Sophie smiled back. "Thank you." Vanessa hesitated briefly before looking at Ethan. "I am glad our paths crossed." Ethan nodded. "So am I." And for the first time, both meant it. A few minutes later, Ethan and Sophie walked through the terminal together. Travelers hurried in every direction. Suitcases rolled across polished floors. Announcements echoed through the building. The world had already moved on. Nobody pointed. Nobody stared. Nobody knew the stories that had unfolded several thousand feet above the ground. Ethan seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Sophie slipped her hand into his. "You know what?" she said. "What?" "Today was still the coolest birthday ever." Ethan laughed. Even with all the unexpected drama, especially because of it. They continued walking beneath the bright terminal lights. Father and daughter. Nothing more. Nothing less. Yet that was enough. Because in the end, the title was never the miracle. The recognition was never the reward. The reward was the little girl walking beside him. The second chances life had given him. The people he had helped without keeping score. The quiet dignity that remained unchanged whether anyone noticed or not. And as Ethan Walker disappeared into the crowd with Sophie at his side, the lesson he left behind was beautifully simple. Character speaks softly. Grace asks for nothing. Respect cannot be purchased. And the strongest people are often the ones who never need the world to know their name.